Good afternoon or good evening and welcome to another of this marathon day of news, information, disinformation day. I think we are living in a very, very important time when it comes to information and what's considered to be an information, disinformation news. We'll discuss a little bit again how we got to this situation, today. And what is the future? What is the future of the news? What is the future of information, its dissemination, and whatsoever? I've got two guests which I actually handpicked for this discussion, and I'll explain why. First guest is Rhona Tarrant. She is an Irish journalist who worked for Irish radio television, national radio television company. She worked as an investigative journalist for National Public Radio in United States in New York. A couple of years ago, she joined a social media news platform called Storyful. She will explain a little bit about what she does. My second guest is Jim Clancy. Jim Clancy has been a journalist for over 4 decades. He spent over 34 years with CNN covering many stories. Over those 34 years with CNN, he became one of the most recognizable and the most significant voices and faces of CNN. As I mentioned, he covered, you think about a story within last 40 years, Jim was there. To me, he is an epitome of a hardcore television journalist. Now, I will be a little bit politically incorrect. The reason why I picked up these two guests to discuss the future of the news is because Jim has become a journalist 20 years before Rhona was born. They come from the two very...
It's yours.
They came from the two very different journalism schools, and that's why I think this may be a very interesting discussion. I have to start with basic questions. Tell me what you do. I mean, what is Storyful? What do you do? What is your job?
Okay, I apologize to anyone who is just here and has to listen to me talk about this twice, so just get that out of the way. So I work with Storyful. It's the world's first social media news agency or social media news analysis agency. So Storyful was set up in 2010. What we do is, we do various different things, but just to give you really quickly what we do. If a news event happens, so for example, a school shooting or, a terror attack in, maybe Kabul or anywhere in the world, when a news event happens, what will happen is there are people on the ground, and more often than not, their initial reaction, especially if they're young, is to start recording it on their phone. So what we do is we find the people on the ground, we find their videos, we verify their videos, the time, date, location, we write news stories about them, and then it goes out in a news wire, which is used by newsrooms all over the world. So CNN, ABC, the New York Times, the Times in London. We work all over the world. We also track disinformation campaigns online. So we work on everything from the US elections to the French elections to the Irish abortion referendum, tracking where the disinformation is coming from online, the so-called fake news, where it starts, where it proliferates, and how it makes its way into the mainstream. So my job, I suppose, on a daily basis is verifying stuff that you guys see on social media.
Jim, I don't think we have to introduce CNN. We don't have to introduce the job of a correspondent and a reporter. But tell me in person, what interested you in journalism? Why did you get to this business?
I just found something that I loved. I just found something that, allowed me to learn every day, to continue to be a student, and then to share it with other people. Stories that I was enthused about, stories that I thought would make my community, make my country better. And those are the things that motivated me. And it was an uplifting job. And they actually paid me, though not very much, to do it. I mean, I started in radio and then crossed over into television, which does pay a lot better than radio does. And I was lucky enough to land at CNN just as they were starting. And so that was it. I mean, and it was all triggered. Actually, I had done some major stories before joining CNN, and that's what enabled me really to attract their attention. Many people here wouldn't remember it, but there was a minister named Jim Jones in San Francisco that used to bring thousands of his followers to political campaign meetings. He became a powerful figure because of that. Served on San Francisco's Housing Authority Commission. Mayor Moscone appointed him to become the head of that commission. He was also a fake faith healer. He was a charlatan. He was trying to instill fear of a race war in order to get the homes away from elderly black people in San Francisco. And I proudly helped run him out of town. But after the Jonestown massacre, in which some 900 people took Flavor Aid that was poisoned with cyanide, the 5 survivors who came back blamed me for the whole thing, saying, you drove them out of San Francisco, and this is what happened. So, with investigative journalism and all that kind of work, you face a backlash. You have these, feelings, well, maybe it was wrong to do that, but, I warned people that he was a killer. And it came true. I mean, those are the kinds of stories that motivated me early on.
Do you study journalism?
I studied journalism, yeah.
How did you study? Tell me what, I studied journalism 25, 30 years ago, but it was way, way, way before the social media. Internet was barely around. What are the major topics you are studying in
honestly, to be honest, it was totally traditional. I did my master's, I think maybe in 2012, 2013 possibly. To be honest, the journalism schools hadn't caught up to the changes in the news industry. So what you had were lecturers who were in their jobs for 10, 20 years, scrambling to try to teach us about the changes in media. So, I learned shorthand in my journalism masters, which I will never, ever, 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 ever use because I have a phone or, recording equipment, or I can write pretty quickly or type. So I was learning all these really traditional things, and what we had as well, we had lecturers who were sort of seizing on the citizen journalism thing. So citizen journalism was like the sexy thing when I was studying my master's, and everyone had a phone, and Storyful had just started, and this was democratization. Anyone could become a reporter. Anyone could pick up a phone. Anyone could report what they're seeing, and this was the big threat to us as journalists. Now, as it transpired, it was pretty obvious that, okay, people can report, and that's our bread and butter in Storyful, in that we are, working with people who are recording news as it happens. But it also didn't replace journalism. It actually made it nearly more important. So what I would say is I was studying the basics, and the basics of journalism, whether you're an international correspondent or working at a desk verifying videos, are exactly the same. Who is your source? How do you know this? Why are they telling you this? Who is saying what? Speaking to different sides. It's not like this sort of magic thing that I think a lot of people think it is. It's actually being a journalist, but using different tools.
It's the basics. We talk about the post-truth era, and we talk about, there's a difference of opinion. There's more than one point of view to this story. One guy says, it's raining outside. The other guy said, no, it's dry, it's not raining outside. My job as a journalist isn't to say, gee, folks, there's 2 points of view here. It's to stick my head out the fucking window and see who's right and report the truth on it. And there are the fundamentals that we come back to every time. What someone says to you is ultimately less important than why they say it to you. And you have to be able to analyze that. Some of it is very subtle, but other times it's very obvious.
Yeah. And we see that, you reported from the field for years. You reported on the ground. You were the man on the ground. In Storyful, we actually do a sort of really unusual thing in that I report from, we cover Syria, as we were this morning before I came here, Gaza, the Land Day protests earlier this year. But what we're doing is we're actually finding the sources on the ground, and we're using their videos to tell the story. But it's extremely difficult to do it when you're doing it online, thousands of miles away. So what we do is we use our, I suppose, social media expertise to vet these sources, to say, is this person really who they say they are, where they say they are? Very often we figure it out pretty quickly if someone is pretending to be on the ground when they're not. And I mean, these are very basic things. You know, if someone is posting a video to their Facebook account or Twitter account, does this person have a history of posting from this location? Can I find other social platforms that they are on? What username are they using? Can I search that username and see who they are connected to, what they are connected to? So it's sort of telling the same stories. However, I would say it's extremely powerful. It's extremely powerful to be able to amplify the sources on the ground. However, it's no replacement for someone actually being there, to be honest. There's a huge limitation to it. I worked as a reporter for 10 years before I moved to Storyful, and there is no comparison to actually being able to talk to people and drag the stories out of them. Because if they don't want you to know something, they're not going to write it on the internet, and it's probably not going to be out there.
And it goes to the integrity of the person. It goes to their understanding of the job. I worked the police beat in San Francisco, and we often worked out of the Hall of Justice in that city. And there was an old guy, an old journalist named Baron Muller. I worked my butt off to bring in the stories, to be there. And somehow Baron never left the Hall of Justice, and he had details on these stories that I could never get. He was always beating me, you know? And I'm putting a lot of work into this. At his retirement party, I said, Baron, how was it possible you did that? I mean, you're leaving, now share the secret with me. And he said it goes back to 1948. We had a particularly brutal double rape homicide. And the call came in, they used to have the police radio would blare out in the press room at the Hall of Justice, that they had cornered the guys on the 4th story of a downtown hotel. So we said, we all ran up there, up the 4 flights of stairs, and he says, right when I get there, I see the 2 cops holding this guy outside the window by his ankles, saying, where's the other one? Where's the other one? Where's the other one? When his shoes came off and they dropped him 4 floors down. And he said, the headline in the Chronicle read the next day, homicide suspect leaps to death from Tenderloin hideout.
Oh my God.
And he said, that's how I beat you. That's how I beat you. So, I mean, you realize that, you know, it's not all that you see, all that's behind the scenes. It does exist, where, you know, stories are changed.
Yeah. You know, we have a very strong political reporting scene in Ireland. We've got a very strong media in Ireland, actually, and I'm actually quite proud of it in Ireland. But what I worry about in terms of new media is I spoke to a girl recently who had worked at a pretty well-known Irish magazine, and this was sort of the new media thing, you know, where journalists come in and they're working online. But her timeline, okay, to start to find a story, to research the story, write the story, fact check the story, and publish the story. Give a guess how long she had.
Oh, I can't guess.
40 minutes.
Oh my God.
40 minutes. So that was the amount of time that she had. So that was the pressure she was under every day at this magazine, to write, research, report, fact check, and publish a story in 40 minutes. And I mean, this is where young journalists are coming in. This is how they're starting. And very often they're not getting the chance to like go out, build the sources, report, find sources, pull it out of people. What they're doing is they're going online and they're rewriting things. They're writing stories about Instagram posts that someone puts up. And that's actually what worries me about the future of journalism, because first of all, a lot of these people leave because it's so bloody depressing to work in it. But second of all, you're actually not getting the time to like train, do your cub reporter work, get out there, build sources.
One of the things I try to stress to young journalists is to use shoe leather, to get out there and work the communities. I think one of the problems that we have in journalism today, and it probably leads to a lot of erroneous reports, but it's the same problem that you're talking about, and that is that people sit there and they stare at these computer screens as if this was the truth coming at them. And they don't really know about their communities. I think in the last election, people really learned that there was a whole part of the United States that wasn't being covered, where people felt out of touch, They felt that the news media didn't represent them or tell their story because they never even bothered to visit. You know, it's basically an industry that's based in New York and to some extent in Los Angeles, but that's more the celebrity end of it all, another money-making tool. And it's a New York view of the entire country. Now, it doesn't explain why you would elect a New Yorker like Donald Trump, but it was people's frustrations. And that's some of the, you know, media trust issues that are out there. Now, this whole post-truth era means people think that their feelings are just as valid as the facts, as the data. That, you know, well, it doesn't matter that, you know, that you say this about global warming. I just don't think that it's true. I don't think we could possibly know. I can't be doing this just because I have some cows out in the South 40. You know, it can't be my fault. You're trying to blame me and make me make sacrifices in my life that I don't want to make. All in the name of this global warming. Prove it to me. And you show them the data and they still don't believe it because they feel that they're entitled to their passion, to their heart.
You know, I might be setting myself up for a huge embarrassment, but this the future of journalism in the post-truth world was actually my idea of this panel. And my question is, do we live in a post-truth world, or is it too pessimistic of an assessment?
I don't think that the world has changed so much in the last 10 years since, you know, social media proliferated. I don't think that we are living in a post-truth world. I think it is definitely we're living in a world where media is less trusted. In Ireland, we have a strange situation where we actually have more trust in media than the global average. I think, like Jim was saying, it's a lot of, well, I believe one thing and I believe one thing, and that's how news organizations are telling the story, and that's a fundamental failure to not report the facts. I think that news organizations are struggling to respond to the changes in online and in news consumption. I think that they are going some way to addressing this through a number of ways. So one way I've seen a lot of news organizations do, and it's what we do in Storyful. So if I write a news story in Storyful, there's a piece on the side of my story which goes out to all of the news organizations that has date, location and source. And in each of those places I say, this is how I know this was filmed on this date because I've seen this other video that shows whatever. This is how I know the location because I've geolocated this mountain to right here, and this is what I see in the video. This is who the source is. So in Storyful, we really go to pains to show how we reported this story, where we got these facts. And more news organizations are actually showing how the sausage is made. So going behind it and saying, how did we find this out? Who is the source? Now, some of that is just trying to rebuild trust in media. And some of that goes to educating readers about how a news story is made and how something becomes fact that is reported. Another thing that's changing is how engagement is built, or how engagement is gauged by a news agency. So 10 years ago, we saw all these news sites jump up in Ireland. So online news platforms that, you know, where a journalist will write 7 news stories in a shift. And these news stories will be, you know, here's the latest. There's one news site that just has, you know, so many clothes, and here's what this celebrity is posting, and it's all waffle. But what used to be gauged is how many times it's clicked into. So the onus was on the news organization to make it as outrageous, as clickable, as shocking as possible to get all of the clicks and this gauged sort of engagement. Now what they're doing is they're actually looking at users and how long they spend on the page when they click into it. How long do they scroll down? Do they get to the end of the article? So more and more news organizations are using that as a way to gauge their audience. So I think news organizations are becoming a little bit more sophisticated, and news organizations are getting more towards, I suppose, understanding how their audience are consuming news. I don't think that it is post-truth or post-fact, but I definitely think that there is a struggle to catch up to where the news industry is now.
And I think it's given by the news environment. Jim, when I started working for television, it was here in this city, in Ostrava, in 1988. And the news in the city were still shot on 16mm film. Yes, communist Czechoslovakia was quite far behind the West, but you also went through several revolutions in the news industry and how
I shot on film, 16mm film. I mean, we did radio on tape when you still spliced with a razor blade and some, you know, Scotch magic tape to put it back together. I mean, but what she's talking about is fundamentally important, because I think Some of the loss of trust in the media comes from the use of anonymous sources. And the fact is, some journalists became very lazy in terms of, okay, I'm working the police beat. I have the same guy, spokesman for the police department, who says, don't use my name. And I'm saying sources say, police sources say, and over, it's the same goddamn source every day, you know? And how credible is that? And I think that a lot of times journalists don't push the sources enough to say, no, you've got to stand up behind this. And what's the result? Political spinmeisters will give you great quotes. You know, they'll give you fantastic quotes, but you can't attribute it to them because they can't really back it up. It's just their opinion. And you enable them to inject this propaganda, this spin, you know, into the story in order to get those great quotes into it. When you need to insist to them, well, look, if you're not going to be responsible for what you say, you know, why should I let you say it? Why should I be the megaphone for you to put all this spin on a story?
Yeah, absolutely. In Ireland, we actually have a tribunal at the moment of investigation into alleged police smearing of a policeman who is a whistleblower. So in Ireland, the Gardaí are police force, so is a Garda. So a Garda, Maurice McCabe, was a whistleblower for penalty points on driver's licenses being cancelled, and a few other things. He was basically a whistleblower to wrongdoing in the police force in Ireland. And there's a tribunal at the moment in Ireland into whether senior Garda sources, right up to the commissioner, placed false information about this whistleblower in the media to undermine him. And it's a real examination of conscience by the Irish media and by Irish people. You know, the allegation is a former Garda press officer who said, yes, I was instructed to spread damaging information about him, including that he was a child abuser, which was false. So this went out to journalists. So this press officer was allegedly texting journalists, and he said he was texting journalists with this information and placing it in the media. So there's this big kind of question at the moment, and the tribunal is still ongoing, about Garda sources, like they are using the media to their own ends to undermine this guy who is, or this police officer who was trying to expose wrongdoing. So it's exactly like you said. For a very long time, they were taking anonymous sources, and there was very little accountability for the people on the other end. When the news organizations, the journalists run this stuff, or it's spread around like rumor, because journalists are the biggest gossips that you will ever meet, myself included. You know, we like to talk. And what will happen is they'll hear something from a Garda source, it'll start circulating, all of a sudden, is there fact to this? You know, it went to the politicians, it was something that everybody was talking about at the time. So it's a real sort of analysis of, did the Gardaí and the journalists become too close in Ireland? Were the journalists doing their due diligence and interrogating the source? The investigation is still ongoing, the tribunal is still ongoing, but it definitely speaks to your point about sources who are putting information out there and not having any repercussions to it.
One of the, you talk about how the technology changed. CNN came along at a time when nobody in the news business, myself included, believed that you could do news 24 hours a day. We had seen the absolute distress, mayhem, and mental illness that had come to the fore trying to produce 30-minute newscasts. And we thought it would be a complete disaster, that it would fall apart instantly. What we didn't realize was that suddenly you had no deadline. You didn't have to make that show at 5 o'clock because there's going to be another show at 6. And you just used the stories that you had and you started plugging them in, and we became very relaxed about it. And suddenly we were filling up that 24-hour wheel. And then everybody realized you can make money off of news. In the past, news had always been funded by nighttime TV, entertainment.
You know, the technology I was talking about is was, I just went to demonstrate it. It was filmed, that it was video, that was satellites, digital files. However, what we are witnessing today, I think, is absolutely unprecedented in the history of journalism. I mean, the number of, as you mentioned at the beginning, today everybody can become a journalist. Everybody, you can make.
I don't think everybody can become. Let me just say, they don't become journalists. They become. How do I put this?
Sources,
They become citizen reporters or
They're not even, I don't even know how to describe it either, to be honest, because what is a reporter? It's someone who takes information. I mean, to be honest with you, anybody who picks up, a lot of the time, anyone who picks up a phone or films something, you know, particularly in a war zone or a place like Gaza, like they have an agenda. They want to get a certain viewpoint out there. That's not to say this viewpoint is not totally legitimate.
Let me just interrupt for a moment. A very important point. If you don't take anything else away with you from our discussion here, if you become a citizen reporter, or whatever we want to call you, and you take video, please, for God's sakes, hold the phone
that
this way.
Please. Seriously, please.
Because when you hold it like that, you get about 1/3 of the video information.
Yeah.
This way, it fills the screen.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
right.
no, that's bane of our lives. Thank you. Yeah.
No, but I tell you, you know, like I was covering a story last week. There was a huge summit between Eritrea and Ethiopia in Eritrea, and of course we don't have any, CNN doesn't have anybody there. So what I did, I went on Twitter and I was following, you know, what is coming from Asmara, what kind of news is coming from Asmara, what kind of pictures are coming from Asmara. Then I start contacting the people on that, through the direct messaging on Twitter or through just messaging on Twitter, and I actually gained some very reliable information. And we, of course, I did due diligence. I called them, you know, I wanted them to send me their ID and what have you, you know, and they did. And so this is something that was absolutely unthinkable 5-10 years, well, 5 years perhaps, you know, but 10 years ago. But the thing is, you also talked a little bit about the loss of credibility in media, the loss of trust in media. But isn't that overflow of information, then that onslaught which is happening on social media, online, where a lot of this information is false, it's untruth, didn't that play the role in undermining the trust in media in general?
Yes, yeah. And a lot of it had to do with, I suppose, a lot of different news sites sort of popping up all of a sudden, and people seeing all these news sources and not kind of being able to interrogate, well, wait, is this a false news site? So it is so easy to build a website and make it look like a newspaper and fool people into thinking that, you know, Pope Francis has endorsed Donald Trump. Maybe not fool them, but get them to click into an article on it. People made a whole lot of money off this, and people further their political means, I suppose, through this. The big failure, I think, like Jim had said, was the failure in the US election. I mean, just to take that as one example, was to actually get out there and to report properly and to actually reflect what people were thinking. So what we had was, you know, we see it in Storyful all the time. We monitor elections and we monitor disinformation campaigns. And what we see are, we see trolls, bots, tricking mainstream media, tricking traditional media into believing what they are reporting or what they are saying is true. And very often it's the journalists who aren't literate enough in far-right platforms or even regular platforms who are actually able to interrogate this information. So there's definitely an onus on the audience to sort of educate themselves, and I have no doubt that people are educating themselves. But a big failure, to be honest, is this social media growing so quickly and the news organizations not being able to respond to it or being well trained enough to actually deal with it.
Jim, what do you contribute to the drop of the the trust in media, traditional media, such as BBC, such as CNN? What do you think is the reason why people became more skeptical or less trusty?
Well, I think, first of all, everybody's got a myriad of choices. And they have found that they can get the news that agrees with their political point or ideological point of view by just going somewhere else. And they have been disappointed by some of the mainstream media. They believe that there's a built-in bias, and they've heard criticism of that, and they've read articles about that, where stories are being challenged like never before. And Storyful is one of the ways that the media itself is being policed today. When mistakes are made, groups like Storyful are able to bring that out, much to the embarrassment of the mainstream media. Everybody, every journalist makes mistakes. It's just hopefully those aren't intentional mistakes. Those happen because of misinformation, or they could have even been deliberately misled. But the ability to stand up and apologize for it still rests, with a media organization. And I have more faith in the New York Times and the Washington Post to do that than websites like InfoWars, which is just all conspiracy theories. And so news consumers have become more discerning and more critical. That's good. You have to get your information from multiple sources. You have to listen to different points of view. A lot of the major newspapers now are trying to represent those multiple points of view, but it's pretty difficult, for one paper to do that or one news outlet to do that. People claim that they're completely unbiased. Nobody's buying that anymore. Every single story really depends on what the journalist brought to it, what efforts they put into, balancing that story, not with alternative facts, but by seeking out and doing the work and obtaining the truth. But if you don't have time to do it, as you were talking about, 40 minutes, to put together the entire story, nobody's going to be able to do that. If you're on the scene of a story and it's just the straight who, what, when, where, why, you can do that in 40 minutes. You can do it in even less than 40 minutes. But if you're getting that story off the internet or you're getting that story off a news feed that you're really not sure about, you've got a really tough job in your hands to try to vet that out and tell what's accurate and what's not, what you should report and what you should not.
Yeah.
I've been talking to journalists here today whole day, and I'm...
We've noticed, and I want to tell you, your stamina is
well
incredible
done.
tonight.
No, thank you.
I'm impressed.
No.
You must have all the answers at this stage.
No, the thing is, I became a little bit optimistic because it seems that everybody is expressing this trust that in people, that the audiences are getting more educated, that the audiences are becoming careful of what they read or what they look at and how they, assess the information. And I just think that this is something that is very, very, very encouraging. Like there were people saying, that we know now that the subscriptions of New York Times and Washington Post are growing again. So, do you think this is going to survive? This era of mistrust of media. Do you think you are optimistic that this is going to change? And that media such as CNN, such as BBC, such as New York Times, with the help of policing organizations like yours, have a future?
Oh, they all have it. Look, if they have a future, the future is in individual enterprise reporting, where a network or a newspaper says, this is a topic we're going to tackle, and this is the way we're going to do it, not relying on sources of social media. You can still you can make that an element of the story, but you make the determination that rather than believe something else, you begin the research from the ground up. Those are things that can build trust. But, in war zones, 1982 in Lebanon was probably the last place where I could cross the lines between the Christian side and the Muslim side with the respect of the gunman who said, well, hey, he's a journalist. He's got to tell both sides of the story. He's got to be able to do that. By the time we arrived in Bosnia, they were dead drunk, holding a deer rifle to your head, demanding that you tell their story. They were taking videotape of dead civilians slaughtered, and in Belgrade it was being run on Yugoslav television as, look, these are dead Serbs. What are we going to do? Playing martial music, getting the Serbs ready for battle. Whereas, meantime, in Zagreb, on the same Yugoslav national network that had been divided now, they're saying, look, these are dead Croats. What are you going to do? Playing the martial music. I mean, I had an editor in Belgrade call me up and he said, Jim, you got me, get me the hell out of here. It's just gone crazy with everybody using the same video clips to try to build up the impetus for war. And then they knew that if they controlled the media, they would control, public opinion about their side in the conflict.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's so interesting to hear you reporting about war, because I suppose we do that in Storyful every day, and I have a wonderful colleague from Syria who I sit beside, and I'm inspired by her all the time. She deals with sources on the ground all of the time, but I suppose for us, when we're, reporting, we are very, very clear that, Sana News Agency, which is the Syrian state news agency, will put out videos all of the time, putting their viewpoint forward, but for us it's so important to get the videos from the other side. And just, I suppose, on a separate point, what you were talking about earlier, like a big news story, yes, the online is an element of the story, but it's not the entire story. But it's very important a lot of the time. So, for example, on the Parkland school shooting, where Nicholas Cruz came in and he shot dead a number of students, we saw this unfold on social media. We saw videos from the scene, and what Storyful were doing was we found out that that was happening very, very quickly through local news sources. We have TweetDeck set up in such a way that we can watch for all breaking news in terms of explosions or active shooters. So we were on that from the very beginning, and we traced that story, and it's really amazing how in any news story that I've worked on, from the Las Vegas shooting to Parkland or any other major news events in the United States, how disinformation campaigns start extremely early. We see the beginning of it in the first few hours. So what this will usually take the form of is some form of far-right or fringe platform, so platforms favoured by the alt-right, 4chan, Gab, Discord, starting to throw out names on public platforms like Twitter or Facebook about who the shooter is, and trying to fool the media into thinking the shooter is a certain person. We also see, for example, after the Parkland...
Meaning, for instance, it's an immigrant from a Muslim country,
or
it's an Antifa protester.
Or there is one poor creator who's always coming up. They send out a picture in his name nearly every time, trying to fool people. But what they know is the news journalists are on Twitter, you know, looking for anything, looking for any break in the story, because Twitter is like you say about moving to 24-hour television. Twitter is like 24-hour television on drugs, in that there is no delay. You type it and you send it. And journalists suffer because everybody needs an editor. I need an editor, you need an editor, editors need editors. But very often you're just tweeting it out. So we see this happening very, very quickly. So when I was working on the Las Vegas shooting, this happened around 6 a.m. Dublin time, or when we found out about it, it was about maybe 7 a.m. So we were on it as it was happening. And what we were doing was we were finding certain keywords, and we were finding videos that were geotagged to the area, finding the videos and watching people cowering from the gunfire very early on. But we also found very early on where there was attempts to say that it was all a hoax. So there was a video of one of the buildings and there was a flashing light, and very early on this took hold as this was a second shooter. There was a second shooter there, and this took off across the platforms. We saw this happen extremely early on. Another example from Parkland was Emma Gonzalez, one of the teenage girls who was in the building at the time, did a photo shoot with Vogue magazine where she was ripping up a Target, and it was, you know, that school students were not going to be targets anymore. But what we actually found in Storyful, we did an analysis, and there was another picture of Emma Gonzalez with the same picture, but what they had done was they photoshopped the American Constitution onto the page, that she was ripping up the American Constitution. So we came across this in Storyful, and we used some technology to show that it's an open source technology to show that this was photoshopped. But what we also did was we traced its origins back to far-right fringe platforms. So very often for elections or breaking news situations or shootings, the disinformation campaigns often begin on these platforms, and then they make their way into Twitter or Facebook, and then sometimes, unfortunately, they make their way into mainstream media or media, traditional media, and into the discourse. So you'd be a fool to think that you can just use online to report a story, but you'd also be a fool to ignore it as well.
One thing that also made me very happy at the beginning of this panel, was to listen to your conversation at the first 10 minutes. Because as I said at the beginning, you became journalists, decades apart. You work in completely different environment and using completely different technologies and tools than Jim did. But when it comes to core values of journalism, you completely share the values. You completely agreed on...
But I concede, she's got better tools. She understands them better, and she's better able to deal with these kinds of problems because she is aware of all of that. Having the fundamentals is fundamental, but today the demands are great. I don't know how young journalists really do it. where, you know, you're expected to, yes, you're going to report your video story, but then will you file for radio, and then we need a piece for the web, and they're going to have you on for the, you know, after
you
the
need
live
to do
shot,
Facebook
you're gonna
Live,
be
and
on
you
the
need to tweet.
podcast,
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You've got so many responsibilities that are coming down on you. You know, it's like watching those TV shows about journalism. I can't stand them because everybody on the TV show, they spend all their time at the damn bar. You don't have it, you know, well, we spent a fair amount of time at the bar in my day, but we were getting sources and working stories.
Yeah, well, I'm jealous of that. I'm really jealous of that you get to do that, because we don't have the time now. You know, we don't have the time to go to a bar and develop sources, and you know, and I don't mean that as in I really respect what you did, because that you had to do it the hard way. You had to go out there and you had to meet people. Very often young journalists don't have to meet a single person from the start of their work week to the end of their work week, and that is not an exaggeration. They do not have to talk to anybody.
That's not healthy. That's not.
It's not healthy, no.
Somebody, I was once told by a fellow, I won't say who it was because I can't remember. They said, you know, how do you spend so much time at the bar? And I said, I don't understand how you don't spend any time at the bar. How do you know what the hell the locals are thinking?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, how are you having any interchange with people? I mean, typically, you know, I'd start interviewing the taxi driver.
That's it.
Coming in from the airport.
That's it.
Everybody I met. You know, if you were doing war corresponding, I mean, the most dangerous place. Everybody always says, oh, what's the most dangerous place you've ever been? It's the empty road.
Yeah.
Because the people that live there aren't on the road, and they know something you don't. And before you go down that road, you better think hard. Yeah. And you better stop everybody you run into and say, what's going on down the road? Yeah. Why isn't there anybody out here? So, you know, having that human contact, I think that's where young journalists are really being penalized today, or they're being really restricted today.
It's a big problem. It's a handicap for young journalists, really. It's a massive problem, because they're not learning how to be like, I'm really lucky I started in traditional. So I had to learn how to, you know, be charming when I needed to be, to press someone when I needed to be, to act a little bit ignorant so they'd help me out a little bit more. Like all the things you need to learn to get a story, to get people to help you, like you know yourself, to extract something from them. Young journalists don't get the chance to actually talk to people, or to get out and talk to people, or worse still, they don't see the need to talk to people, which is the most worrying thing. The other thing I will say is there's a huge burnout in my industry in terms of people who are watching vicariously. They're getting vicariously traumatized by the things they see online. And I often think it's a more holistic experience to report traditionally, to have that human connection. There is something uplifting and personally enriching about it. If you're spending your day reviewing videos from the Gaza border and you're verifying them stuff, often you can go home and you're completely zapped. You don't know how this is affecting you, but somehow in a day's time you're absolutely drained and you're exhausted. So there were massive problems, and I genuinely think a lot of young journalists just burn out. They just say, this is not for me, because they're not getting that experience to actually be enriched by what they do, like what you talked about. You
know, and the thing about the problem is watching it online, you see all the worst bits.
Yeah.
And the truth about war is it does bring out the worst in people, but it also brings out the best. You see people that risk their lives to save someone they don't even know. You get to meet those people. They fill you with hope.
Yeah.
You know, and when you don't get that, when all you're getting is one side of the story, that brutal side of the story, you know, to this day, I still remember the scenes of the Rwanda genocide. And if it hadn't been for some of the people that I met in Rwanda and their peaceful response to the events that happened there, you know, the way some of them joked, you know, because the Africans like to take a walk in the evening, and Rwandans are no different. And they had a joke that's saying, isn't it wonderful? I mean, you know, post-genocide, we can go walking with the entire family.
Oh, my God.
There's only like 3 of us. They had
some
a sense of humor, a gallows humor, whatever you want to call it. But, I mean, at least they had something.
Yeah.
And, you know, they gave you something back as a journalist. And my God, the richness and texture of the story. You can't write stories like that by looking at videos.
No, you can't.
You can't smell the story. And believe me, the Rwanda genocide was a story, the smell of which would never escape you if you had been there. And I mean, just the things going on in the periphery. while the dogs all being shot
Yeah.
in the entire country because they had learned to dine on human flesh. And they traveled then in packs. I mean, things that didn't get reported so much, but you saw that going on. Monkeys going crazy, children no longer trusting adults. All of these things that you got to eyewitness,
Yeah,
indelible, and in your writing. They're just imbued deeply in your writing. And it's saddening to hear that young journalists burning out just watching the worst of the worst videos.
Yeah, no, and you're so right. For example, the chemical attacks in Syria, we verified videos of, families choking, and we verified videos of the US strikes on Syria earlier this year. We are extremely important to news organizations. Like, my colleagues are absolutely wonderful. We find the videos, we find the sources, we find people for the news organizations to interview on the ground in a way that they would, and we connect with them through social media. So because they're uploading from a video geotagged to a location, we can connect with them and say, interview them and write a story about them. And we can connect news organizations with these people all over the world to the people on the front line. I was working this day last week, as I mentioned earlier, on Nicaragua, and what I was seeing was I was able to crack into a network of videos where students were saying goodbye to their parents. They were being fired on by militia, and they were saying goodbye to their parents because they were behind a wall and they thought they were going to die, and they were just crying, and they were live streaming these goodbyes. So I was able to actually talk to them, and we got their videos out there, and we got their stories told, and they told their own stories. It's a very empowering thing. However, we only see so much, and you need people on the ground. You need someone to give that bit of nuance, to drag the story out of people, to tell news is something, the saying goes, something someone doesn't want you to know, basically. The rest is just PR. You need people to actually be able to pull that story out there. And it is sort of saddening to see so many young people sort of burning out of the industry before they even really get going. But then you see a lot of sort of young journalists saying, traditional media doesn't really work for a lot of people, and I want to build something new. So, I mean, that is quite inspiring. I just wonder, though, will anyone of my generation, or will many people of my generation, get the experiences that you got, because back then you needed to go there to do it?
I feel that was a gift. It was a great honor. It was a privilege to be able to, to be flown into places where, the downstroke of some of the stories in Africa, an easy $100,000 the network would have to commit. And as an individual, people just aren't able to afford that. I'll fly commercially to Nairobi, and then we'll charter a twin-engine plane and bring all of our water and everything with us, and, we'll go in and we'll find some place to stay. We're in a villa for a month. How do you do that as an individual? Yeah. You don't.
Yeah, you don't.
But this sort of reporting is not over. There are still a lot of crews out there, and in war zones, in disaster zones.
And people that are there, the local
yes.
people that were so important. Because one of the problems with news was that, people parachute into these stories.
Yeah,
You become a parachute journalist.
Yeah.
And you really depend on the local people. They don't get much credit, or they didn't get much credit then. But without them, you didn't know the story. You weren't introduced to the different people. So you didn't understand it really well. I was in Rwanda. We were inside the prison, and they were terrible conditions. And my translator, who later became a member of the Supreme Court of Rwanda, said, "Look at them." He said, they were the leaders of the genocide. And today they're in a special wing of the prison. They have more space. They have blackboards. He said, they're still the leaders of this. It's, the idea of genocide hasn't gone away for these people. And they're still holding court over the rest of them. I would have never seen that without this Tarsus Karugarama, showing me that and opening my eyes to that, because it just took one look around going, hey, you're absolutely right. So having that, having locals there is very important. Yeah. It's how much trust you have in the locals to report on what's coming out of Somalia, what's coming out of many of the places that news organizations can't get.
Yeah.
And I think this sort of, I don't think this sort of reporting will ever go away. Unfortunately, or not unfortunately necessarily, but with the coming of social media, coming of all these other platforms which can disseminate information, you are a brand new service. I mean, Storyful was not needed 10 years ago, but now it is needed.
It's vital now.
It is absolutely vital.
It is a vital part of the story.
It is a vital. So it is a little bit different type of journalism, and it doesn't mean that this sort of journalism, depends when you end up, is going away. We have less than 10 minutes left. I would like to offer the floor to the audience if they have any questions. There is a first question right there.
Hey, thank you very much. I've been to a lot of these discussions. I'm a big fan of journalism and the work you guys do. What you're doing is amazing. I hope it pans out. My question about the post-truth world. I spent 20 years in Hollywood. One of the biggest changes I've seen is the commercialization of the news and also the sudden stardom of the newscasters. I don't remember seeing Walter Cronkite in the movies. I don't remember seeing Frank Reynolds in the movies, but with the CNN generation, there's been this nice little flow that, okay, we're doing a news story for Godzilla. We need CNN anchor and MSNBC talking head. Do you mind showing up in our film to add a little realism? And does that...
actually, is that Tim Lister in the back of the room? Over there? I can't really see. CNN banned it for a while. CNN anchors weren't allowed to appear in any movie. I mean, a lot of them really wanted to, but they weren't able to do it. I don't know if it's still the same.
But does that blend? Is that part of the problem why we're living in a post-truth era? Because
you've hit on it. Look, I think you've hit on it in a way. And here's the thing. You know well in London they have, what is that, not the Truth Commission, but they oversee broadcasting, and they don't allow any advertising in news shows.
Yeah.
Right? And I could never get any funding for Inside Africa because I had to keep it feature. I couldn't put news in there because we needed the money to flowing in, so we needed to have advertising. The idea was that the audience would get confused. Well, the problem is that with modern PR and political PR, it's basically advertising. A lot of what is in the news is basically advertising, and it goes both ways, where the news media is advertising and popular entertainment, I think. But it's a good analogy. I think that it's like some of what you see is an advertisement. And there was even the government was doing handout tapes in the United States. Different agencies would give a handout tape that had video that was obviously shot and edited in order to support, whatever government office or agency that it was.
Well, I had an editor one time who told me that newspapers is 100% journalism, radio is about 80% journalism, and TV is about 50%. The rest is theatre. And I think that's definitely become more and more the case with television. It's 50% journalism, 50% theatre, and how they can entertain you and draw you in and become, the highest rated TV show or whatever. Thankfully, I've never worked in television news. I've never had to deal with that.
I don't mean to press, but I mean, the follow-up to this is the problem with Fox News. This is the Sean Hannity thing, which my mother is convinced he's a journalist. Everyone in this room knows that's a bullshit statement, but they can't tell the difference. The general public can't tell the difference anymore when they see their late night talk, news hosts.
He's an actor. He's a propagandist.
But everyone on CNN has done that too. You've all dipped
everybody,
into that well.
Yeah, you're right.
And I'm a USC film school grad. It was great to have you guys on the set, but something broke. You broke that wall between Walter Cronkite telling the truth from a desk, and hey, there's
show business.
It's show business.
TV is a lot of show business. Acting comes with that. And, people's reactions, all the way down to correspondents who go for the bang bang in their stories. I mean, I remember in Beirut where people would, grab the camera crew, get out there, they're firing bullets, now I'll do my stand-up, And there was the rare cases when the two actually coincided. I remember riding in a bus with a Japanese journalist, and everybody got to get out, and it was the Iraqis taking us around, and the Japanese guy got out and started behaving as if he was under gunfire. He jumped in the bottom of the ditch, was rolling around and everything, and his cameraman was following him, and he was talking a mile a minute. We didn't understand a thing, but everybody's sitting on the bus watching this guy do this. And all we could do at the end of it was give him a huge round of applause because, I mean, he put on a hell of a performance.
Oh my God.
But that was going to go on the news in Japan.
But what you are saying, I think it comes down to individual. I mean, I've been lucky. I've been working with so many journalists who actually did want to stay away from camera. You know, this story is not about me. This story is not about, you know, yes, I'm here to deliver it, you know. So it depends. I mean, journalists are not as, you know, every person has a different individuality, personality, a different approach. And I agree that some of them want to push themselves, you know, but I was lucky enough to work with most of the people, including you, I was working for them the story was more important than themselves, you know, but again, I don't think it's necessarily a network issue, it's also very often an individual issue. Anybody else? We have Bruce.
Hi, I was Jim's producer 20 years ago in Atlanta.
And a good one.
At CNN. And we're old friends with Tomasz as well, and I've worked with Storyful. And I do disagree I'm the resident pessimist here about what's going on in the world. You know, there's this old quote that a lie travels around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And yes, you know, a lot of things that are going on in the world have made journalism better. New York Times is getting better, more money is flowing in. But we're also in a situation now where a lot of bad things are going around social media. So, you know, I'm curious, how many people here have shared an in-depth journalism report or investigation on their social media? I'm a news junkie, I know I have. How many have shared a meme or a GIF that made some political point for their friends on social media? A few more. It's the emotional chords that are hitting people, that are causing people to share information, that are causing sometimes these simplistic fake news things that are traveling around the world. How do you, maybe we live in a bubble, we who are, you know, self-selecting, who are coming to forums like this, who care about things like this, we think we know what's going on in the world, but maybe we live in a bubble. What do you think about that?
I'm retired. That's a tough question, and I'm going to let Rhona answer it.
Well, I would say that I was speaking earlier about the Channel 4 Dispatches programme, which went out this week, which showed, it went undercover in Facebook in Dublin, the moderators, and it showed a reluctance to take down material that was extremely graphic for various reasons. And there's a whole conversation now in Ireland, because they're all headquartered in Ireland, the European headquarters in Ireland, about how do we deal with this? How do we, you know, work on this? We also had a massive problem in the Irish abortion referendum with disinformation, fake pages. The answer is, I don't even think that the social media pages know what's going on, or social media companies know what's going on. In Storyful, we go some way to tracking disinformation campaigns. So our new intelligence unit has been working on the Irish abortion referendum, the French elections, the US midterm elections, and we are only tracking it now. To be honest, we actually don't know. And I was saying earlier that I do think news audiences are becoming smarter and they're becoming more aware, but then also the gamers, the people who are gaming the system and producing fake news, are also becoming smarter. To be honest, I really don't know. The only thing I can say is that we are seeing patterns in any breaking news event about disinformation coming out very quickly. It's starting on platforms that are sort of fringe and making their way to the surface. Once we crack that, it's going to change again. And, you know, they're going to always be one step ahead of us to a certain extent. I do think that, and I always think that we are in the wild west of social media, and, you know, we can't even imagine what's going to happen in 3, 4, 5 years' time. So to be honest with you, I don't really spend much time really worrying about it. I just know they're going to be one step ahead of us, and we have to work extremely hard to catch up with them.
We are almost out of time. One more space. I mean, we have a space for one more question, if there is any.
So what I would like to ask about is, you know, you mentioned the school shooting and how on Twitter you could see it basically happening second by second, and the children were posting videos of like basically where they are. And my question to you is, do you think it's maybe a little too dangerous that basically they could give their position away because the killer could just as easily check his phone, go on Twitter and see where the kids were hiding? Do you think maybe reporting in certain situations, like it's being so live that you can literally tell where the people are, is maybe a little too dangerous?
Well, we saw it 2 weeks ago at that Capital Gazette shooting that one intern actually, when a gunman came to that newspaper in Annapolis, that one intern was actually under the table and tweeted out the location and for 999 for help. So it was actually used in that situation. Absolutely. In Storyful, we often deal with situations where people are being shot at as we're seeing their videos go live. We have extremely clear guidelines in that we would never contact someone in the middle of an active shooter situation. We would never contact them just in case their phone might go off. Yeah, and I definitely think you really have a point about news organizations, I suppose, using this. To be honest, I don't think it's very likely that a shooter in the middle of an active situation would check their phone and be able to find this out in a very fast situation. But I do think that there is a very, you raise a good point about, I suppose, the ethics of social media reporting. So there's this sort of ambulance chasing that happens when there's a news story like Las Vegas where everyone is after the same videos. These people are being traumatized. They're, mightn't be safe. And news organizations are trying to get in touch with them, trying to call them, basically asking permission to use their videos. So there definitely has to be a very clear line, and especially in terms of like outreach to people in those situations. And often it's quite hard to do that online.
I'm just going to put in one last word for my friend and former producer Bruce Jacobs, where a meme really works. And I saw the meme and it said, in case of fire, use the stairs. Don't stop to tweet.
Exactly.
So, I mean, sometimes it works.
Guys, you've been terrific. Thank you very much to our guests. Thank you for your talk coming. Thank you.
Thank you. No, good.